大家好，歡迎收睇今晚嘅26分鐘見證實錄。2017年卑詩省選，原本執政咗16年嘅卑詩自由黨，因為關鍵嘅一席痛失執政權。咁到咗2020年嘅省選，卑詩自由黨繼續流失更多議席，只係贏得28席。咁時任嘅黨領韋勤遜亦都隨即宣布辭去黨領嘅職務。而該黨喺今年嘅2月初，終於選出新黨領。卑詩前內閣廳長 Kevin Falcon 馮宜幹成功當選。馮宜幹曾經喺前卑詩自由黨政府年代擔任過財政、衛生以及運輸廳長等多個重要職務。佢強調佢要重建以及重整該黨，同埋修復上屆省選卑詩自由黨嘅失地。到底喺呢方面佢有啲乜嘢計劃呢？而面對現時喺民意支持中有穩定支持嘅卑詩新民主黨，佢又會點樣應對呢？喺今晚嘅節目裏面，我哋就請嚟咗卑詩自由黨新任黨領馮宜幹進行專訪。Mr. Falcon 你好，首先恭喜你當選卑詩自由黨黨領，亦都多謝你接受我哋今次嘅專訪㗎。
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, Ada.
咁你離開咗政壇差唔多10年啦，點解會選擇喺呢一個時候回歸政壇嘅呢？
Because I was very concerned about what is happening in politics, not just in British Columbia, but frankly, right across the Western world. And the lack of leadership and the lack of competence in politics really gravely concerned me. And I thought about my two daughters who are 9 and 12, and I thought, we need to have the kind of leadership in British Columbia that will be thinking about that next generation and how we make sure that we're making decisions that take into account that next generation, whether it's on the environment, whether it's about the investment in much needed infrastructure, whether it's about changes we need to make in healthcare. All of those things require someone who's a leader who has a track record of getting things done. And although many people, quite frankly, almost everybody I know, especially in the business community, thinks I'm crazy for going back into public life, I'm doing it because I really do care about this province. And I care about making sure that we've got the kind of leadership in government that is going to make the right decisions for our kids.
咁你現時已經當選卑詩自由黨黨領啦，你優先要處理嘅事項係乜嘢啊？
Well, the key ones for me are the whole issue of affordability, because affordability means trying to keep costs down for families in British Columbia. Right now, in everything, grocery prices are some of the highest increases we've seen in a long time. Gas prices, the highest we've seen in the history of British Columbia and the highest in North America. Housing prices, after 5 years of NDP government, the highest we've ever seen in the history of our province, in spite of all the new taxes and costs that they've imposed on housing. So all of these things are just making it more expensive for families to try and raise their families here in British Columbia. And it's not being addressed by the government. So affordability is a big part. The other is the competence, the ability to get big things done and get them done in a timely way. So for example, when the government says, we're going to redevelop the hospital in Richmond, that's an important promise to make. But you know what? It's not good enough if they make that promise and then you look to see if there's money in the budget, and there's no money in the budget to actually get it done. That's a real problem. And the final thing is just transparency and candor and honesty with the public. So the National Association of Journalists said that this NDP government is the most secretive government in Canada. They're making it harder to get information from government. So British Columbians and journalists can't get access to information from government. And when they do, the government's now going to charge them money to try and dissuade them from trying to get information from their own government. That's not right.
你係咪打算要為卑詩自由黨改新名呢？咁同埋點解你認為有呢一個需要呢？
Primarily because what I've heard across the province, and frankly, I've been hearing this for 20 years now, is that there's real confusion in voters between the BC Liberal Party and the federal party that's also called Liberal, even though there's no connection between the two parties. Because the name's the same, you get a lot of confusion. So Liberals think, okay, we must be Liberals like the federal Liberals. Conservatives get confused and think, oh, they must be Liberals. I'm a Conservative, so I can't vote for them. And it just creates a lot of confusion that I don't think we want to have out there. So I'd like to see if we can come up with a name that everyone can feel comfortable voting for without any confusion.
咁你有冇諗過新嘅名可以叫乜嘢啊？
No, not right now. I have nothing to announce, but I am putting together a group at the party that will look at some options so that we can look at some suggested names, and then we'll bring those to our party membership at the next meeting of our convention to allow the membership to decide, whether they want to change the name, and if so, what the new name would be.
咁你目前喺省議會內就仍然未有議席啊。咁對於你要履行新黨領嘅職務有啲乜嘢挑戰啊？喺補選之前啊，你又會專注喺邊方面嘅工作咧？
So I'm going to be focusing on rebuilding our party, making sure our party is more diverse. I just want to make sure that our party and our candidates are going to reflect the communities that we hope to represent. That's very, very important to me because I know there are some really great, competent people in the Asian community, for example, who I would like to attract and encourage to run with the BC Liberals because they're highly competent and they've got great skills that I think will be very valuable for British Columbians. And we've certainly seen that with Michael Lee and Teresa Watt and John Yap in the past. Great British Columbians who happen to be of Asian descent. I just want to make sure our party represents all the different groups out there. That's very important to me. And I also want to make sure that we focus on letting British Columbians know that results really matter to us, that we want to be judged on results, as every government should be, and we want to make sure that this government is being held accountable when they're not getting results. And we educate people to understand that a promise is one thing, but results are the most important thing.
咁卑詩自由黨喺上屆省選之後，喺省議會只係剩翻28席。咁你有啲乜嘢計劃去重建卑詩自由黨啊？
By first making sure that we have policies that are big ideas that will attract people to our party and say, yes, that is a party that I like their policies and they deserve my support. So that's important. Making sure that we have candidates that also reflect our community and our outstanding candidates, because I want people to look and say, those are really great candidates that are running with Kevin Falcon, and I sure think they're worth supporting. So we have to earn back that support from British Columbians. Now, look, we lost the last election, I would argue, in large part because of the pandemic. And, even though we had passed a law when we were in government saying that there are fixed election dates every 4 years and the government's not allowed to call an election when they think it's convenient. Unfortunately, the NDP government changed the legislation and said, well, we want to call an election during a pandemic because they knew that they would benefit from that. Because British Columbians they're not going to change government in the middle of a crisis like that. And so I understand why they did it, but it was still wrong. But it doesn't matter. We have 28 highly capable, very, very good MLAs. And going forward, we're going to attract some other exceptional candidates. And by the time we go to the next election, just over 2 years from now, I will make sure that we are putting forward some great people with great policies to ensure that we earn the support of British Columbians.
你喺金寶爾同簡惠之執政嘅年代啊，都曾經擔任唔同嘅內閣重要職務。你會點樣說服卑詩省民，你能夠真正為卑詩自由黨注入新方向呢？
Well, I think, first of all, just by watching what I do, as I mentioned earlier, my campaign team, I think of young, diverse group of people as a good example of exactly what I think I represent and what I'm going to be bringing to the public. But also experience matters a lot. I can tell you, being a Minister of Transportation for 6 years, having built the Canada Line, the Evergreen Line, the Sea to Sky Highway, the Portman Bridge, the Pitt River Bridge, I mean, all of these point to experience that is really valuable. Having been a former health minister that did the $500 million expansion to the Surrey Memorial Hospital, that built a cancer center up in Prince George and built hospitals throughout the province. That's track record I'm very, very proud of. And what is missing in this current government is that private sector experience, that business experience that is so necessary when you're running a $70 billion organization called the Government of British Columbia.
有冇邊啲前卑詩自由黨政府嘅政策，你喺今時今日仍然係希望延續推行落去㗎？
Well, when I first ran for office in 2001, we made a list of commitments to British Columbians, and we said, we want you to hold us to account for these. There was, I believe, 212 specific commitments. Everything from a significant personal income tax reduction to making sure we balance the budget by year 3, our first 3 years in office, that we would balance the budget by restoring our fiscal responsibility in government, because the NDP had run deficits almost every year they were in power, and they doubled the debt. Kind of similar to what you're seeing them do now with this budget, where they're going to double the debt in a matter of 3 years to over $100 billion, the highest it's ever been in the history of the province. This is sort of what they do. But what we said is that we would make all these commitments, but most importantly, we followed through. We did a 25% personal income tax cut on our very first day in office. We did balance the budget by year 3, like we promised to do. We restored our AAA credit rating. We invested in hospitals and schools and bridges and road improvements right across the province of British Columbia. And that's what I think the public expects out of leaders, to make commitments, follow through on those commitments, and get things done for the benefit of the public at large. I intend to continue making sure that we're going to be a government that gets big things done.
咁又有冇任何之前你支持過嘅政策，但係目前咧你認為已經唔再適用啊？畢竟咧我哋而家已經面對唔同嘅環境啦，尤其係經歷過2年嘅疫情添。
Sure, absolutely. Look, government always has to adapt. I was a Minister of Finance in the wake of the global economic meltdown. When the economies around the world seized up, people couldn't access credit. There was a crisis everywhere. That was a very, very challenging period of time for government, not unlike the pandemic, just a different kind of challenge. What concerns me most about our current NDP government is their inability to get the big things they promised done. So when they talk about $10 a day daycare, they've been talking about that since 2017. This is now their 6th budget number 6. And in this budget, they're saying, well, we're excited because we'll get to $20 a day daycare, maybe over the next 2 years. Well, that's a far cry from, 2017, when I'm sure there were many families in Richmond and Surrey and Delta and around the British Columbia that were saying, oh, good, I can't wait for $10 a day daycare for my young toddler. Well, the problem is that young toddler will be in high school by the time they ever see $10 a day daycare in British Columbia.
根據 ResearchCo 近期所作嘅民意調查顯示啊，省長賀錦以及卑詩新民主黨啦，仍然維持穩健嘅支持率。咁你認為對於卑詩自由黨嚟講，呢一個係咪一個警號啊？
Not at all. Not at all. In fact, it showed us at our highest level that we've been at for quite some time, which is nice. It was 46% for NDP, 38% for the BC Liberals, which to me is that's getting us right close to where we need to be. But look, what I said to my caucus when I became their leader is, look, you're going to have to ignore the polls and ignore the pundits for at least 2 years, because it's going to take time for us to do the work that we have to do to earn back the trust and support of British Columbia.
馮宜幹目前喺省議會之中仍然未有議席。不過，原本喺溫哥華 Coachella 選區嘅省議員韋勤信就將會讓出議席俾馮宜幹喺該區進行補選。究竟馮宜幹喺各項嘅議題上有啲乜嘢睇法同立場呢？重投政壇嘅馮宜幹希望為卑詩省民做啲乜嘢啦？我哋休息翻嚟再去繼續了解。翻嚟節目時間，經歷2年嘅疫情，卑詩省目前除咗要抗疫之外啊，重建經濟、住屋可負擔性、氣候變化危機、濫藥問題等等，都係省內目前所面對嘅挑戰。咁馮宜幹喺呢啲嘅議題上有啲乜嘢意見同埋睇法啦？佢又會點樣帶領卑詩自由黨去備戰下一屆嘅省選呢？卑詩財政廳長上個星期初就公布咗2022至2023年度嘅財政預算案啦。咁當中包含55億元赤字，同時亦都提出多項嘅撥款。咁你認為啊，呢一份嘅預算案欠缺咗啲乜嘢呢？而當中又有冇一啲你哋卑詩自由黨都認同嘅地方呢？
Yes. So I've always said that, when the NDP do something good, I will say so publicly. So, for example, when they announced a couple of weeks ago that they were supporting a new Chinese museum in Chinatown, That's something that we immediately came out and said. Teresa Watt and Michael Lee and myself came out very supportive of and congratulated the government for that. But, as a former finance minister, the first thing I did was look in the budget to see where the dollars that they'd put aside for that museum, and there was nothing in the budget. And that concerns me because, again, it's one thing to make a promise, but I'd like to see the evidence of that in the budget. And if it's not there, that means it's not happening, just so you know, because we are required under the budget laws that govern British Columbia that we brought in as BC Liberals, that if we're going to make a commitment, that it's not a real commitment until the dollars are in the budget. And sadly, I didn't see any of those dollars there.
咁省府早前公布嘅施政報告重點依然都係放喺處理疫情。你同卑斯自由黨會點樣監察同埋確保本省有理想嘅復甦進度啊？
Well, I sure wish they had acted a lot earlier and a lot more substantially to support the small business community. So, as a business person, I say to myself, okay, when you've got a major crisis like this, it affects people differently and affects industries differently. Clearly, one of the industries that was most impacted was hospitality and tourism. That's where you should be disproportionately focusing your dollars to help those that are being hurt the most to get through it. And instead, what we've had is a government that has, in fact, done the reverse. They've added new costs. The employer health tax is one. They've added 5 paid sick days and lowered and put that cost onto the small business community instead of saying, we want you to add 5 6 days, but we're gonna take care of that cost for you until we get out of this pandemic. But they didn't do any of that. They just made a bad situation even worse. And I think that's very unfortunate.
你會點樣評價省府嘅疫情應對工作啊？有啲乜嘢地方你認為可以再做多啲嘅呢？
I think really fell short was their support for small business. Too little, too late, way too complex. I mean, you will recall back in the fall that they had to change the application process because they'd made it so complex and so difficult to access these minor grants that they were giving out to small business. I think the public frustration is growing a little bit. And what I've said to the NDP government is it's very important that they provide clarity about how we're coming out of this and when they're going to remove the mask mandates, the vaccine passports, et cetera, and what evidence they will be basing that decision on, because they can no longer say, just trust us. They have to actually demonstrate on what basis they're making those decisions. And they've got to stop really making really not very smart decisions. Like they've had rapid tests sitting in warehouses in this province for like months and months and months when we could have really used them, especially at seniors facilities and at schools where, we want to control the spread of COVID. And only now is the government starting to distribute these rapid care tests through the school system to kids going home. But, at a time when, Omicron has dramatically dropped off, and we could have used them 2 months ago for sure, big time. That would have been very, very helpful. By the time they finally get them out the door to British Columbians, it's virtually too late, and that's unfortunate.
你離開政壇期間啊，去到為私營房屋發展商工作，呢一段時間嘅經驗有冇啟發到你一啲新想法去解決房屋可負擔性嘅問題啊？
It sure does, because I've always said that I think it would be nice to have a premier of the province that actually understands the housing industry, because this premier and this government doesn't. And it's not their fault. It's just none of them come from a business background that would, give them the insight and the skill set to understand what's happening in the housing market. So when they introduced all their new taxes in 2018 and then tried to blame rising house prices on foreign buyers, which frankly contributed to a lot of very unnecessary racism against Asians in particular, they were wrong. They were completely wrong. The last 2 years have demonstrated during COVID, we've had no foreigners moving into British Columbia because they've been unable to. The borders have virtually been closed off. And so there's been virtually no foreign buying of residential housing in British Columbia for 2 years. And yet house prices have continued to escalate, as I knew they would, and as anyone in the industry knew they would, because the real issue is there's a huge problem of supply. And adding all their new taxes that they added back in 2018 did nothing to improve housing affordability. And as we've always said, unless you get more supply, you're not going to have any chance of reducing the inflationary cost of housing. And in their own budget that just came out now, if you look, you will see that their housing supply is forecast to be decreasing over the next few years.
你會唔會支持廢除卑斯新民主黨引入嘅卑斯投機稅呢？
No, and this is something the NDP tried to say I'm going to do. No, that's not what I've said. What I have said is that I'm going to look at all the taxes and costs that governments, not just provincial, but local, are adding to housing, because I know that 25% of the cost of every new home built today is made up of government fees, taxes, permit fees, property transfer taxes, PST, development cost charges, community amenity contributions, on and on that list goes. It's a very long list, by the way. And that is making it a barrier for young people and first-time buyers to get into the housing market. What I have said is I'm going to look at all of the costs that government is imposing, and I'm going to look at those costs through the lens of a first-time buyer, so that we can say, what costs can we strip out so that a first-time buyer, a British Columbia resident, a Canadian citizen can have a realistic opportunity to get into the housing market.
你會主張點樣處理氣候變化危機啊？如果你保持翻前卑斯自由黨政府喺呢方面嘅方針啊，你又會唔會擔心咁樣難以爭取翻之前由卑斯自由黨流失咗去卑斯綠黨嘅支持呢？
No, listen, one of the things I'm most proud of is that I was part of the government that in 2008 introduced North America's very first revenue neutral carbon tax. The important thing to understand is that the revenue neutral carbon tax was like a bargain that we made with the public. We said, we are going to increase carbon taxes, but in law, we're going to make sure that every penny the government generates from that increased carbon tax will go towards reductions in personal income tax and small business taxes. That was written into law. Unfortunately, when the NDP got into power, one of the first things they changed in their first budget, they said, oh, no, we can't possibly give money back to citizens. We have to change the law, which they did, and they turned it from a tax shift into a tax grab, so that all the money now goes into government and they spend it on whatever they decide to spend money on. That's not right. And that's not leadership. And so the one tax change I can commit to today is that I will move back immediately to making the carbon tax revenue neutral, so that we return those dollars right back to British Columbians in the form of lower taxes. I will invest in the kind of infrastructure that I call resiliency infrastructure, that protects us from a future of increased forest fires, increased flooding, so that we are protecting future generations by making upfront investments today. That's the kind of thing that, the kind of leadership that we need. I will also make sure we protect biodiversity, make sure that we continue to have the cleanest, freshest air, the cleanest water, and parks and forests that we can all walk through and be proud of. That's something I feel very strongly about. And the environment was barely mentioned in this budget.
卑斯省服用過量毒品致死嘅問題越嚟越嚴重，每一日咧都有人因為服用過量毒品而死亡。咁大家都認同啊，要喺呢方面做多啲功夫。但係你認為應該用乜嘢方法去做呢？
I would do it totally differently. First of all, the focus of this NDP government, all they talk about is safe supply. If we just give people free drugs that are safe, we're going to solve this problem. That is just simply not the case. It's very important to understand that we need to make investments in recovery, that we help drug addicts get off of their addictions so that they can become productive members of society again. Most of the people that are overdosing in our province are men, about 78% of them. They're from all over the province, by the way. And many of them are not the people that you see in the streets. They're often in their own homes or apartments, recreationally using drugs, not knowing or expecting that they're going to die as a result of their recreational use of drugs. So we have to make sure we eliminate the stigma associated with addiction. It's very normal. People get addicted to things, and we need to understand and treat it like a health issue. But we also need to make sure the resources are there to help them get off of their addictions. And that's something that we as BC Liberals would focus far more attention on.
Mr. Falcon, 再次多謝你接受我哋今次嘅專訪啊！
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
好啦，今晚嘅節目時間咧又差唔多啦。咁如果觀眾對我哋嘅節目有啲乜嘢意見嘅話，係可以以電郵嘅方式同我哋聯絡㗎。咁如果觀眾想重溫翻今集嘅節目，亦都可以上到去我哋嘅網站，點擊節目重溫一欄。下星期同樣時間再同大家見面，晚安。